Welcome to another Sunday morning rant. Well, Sunday evening rant, to be more precisely. I've been out bowling with Paula Penguin for her birthday today. She has made it to grand old age of 12. And I'm rubbish at bowling, but it was a good fun afternoon out. Anyway, this rant is entitled Ensoniq Waterfall. Now, again, those of you who watch the channel on a regular basis will know that before Christmas I did a mailbag item where somebody said, why not have a look at Ensoniq products, Nord products, Alsys products, whatever it happens, rather than sort of the stable products that I seem to be looking at the moment, which is sort of kind of the Korgs, the Rolands, and the Yamahas. Well, I've always been comfortable in the Korgs, the Rolands, and the Yamahas because that's what I've had for nigh on 20 plus years. I've had plays and dalliances with other machines, but I never really owned them for very long if I've had other machines because I kind of never really got on with them. Anyway, that said, after that rant, I got offered an EPS 16 Plus, which is a sampling keyboard made by Ensoniq in 1990. And I premiered that keyboard on the channel on the last rant of 2019. So last rant, I think it was the 29th of December 2019, if my memory serves correctly. And if I'm brutally honest, I haven't really had time to play with very much since then, because pretty much since the beginning of this year, I've been away on business. So where you have seen me doing recordings, I've literally arrived, pitched up at home, and done a lot of recording very, very quickly, or I've done recordings while I've been away, just to try and keep the material running through. But I haven't actually had a chance to sit down at home and play with this stuff. Anyway, a long story short, I was contacted by somebody who said, would I give an SQ2 a good home? So, this is an SQ2. It comes with its own keyboard cover, which, unlike my nice red covers that I have in the studio, this is it kind of reminds me sort of like an Arabic or Moroccan, the colours and the patterns and what have you. Somebody would probably shout at me and say it's got nothing to do with Arabic or Moroccan. Well, fair enough, but it kind of reminds me of that, given the what it is. I suspect it's somebody has recycled their curtains at some point. That's kind of what it feels like. But it came in fully boxed with a dust cover. This is the dust cover that's been sitting on it, and it's incredibly good condition for something that is now 30 years old. Now I will lift this up, but this is incredibly heavy. Oh, God, like that. So there you go. One Ensoniq SQ2. So this is sort of the basic stats of this thing. It is a 76 note keyboard. It is incredibly well built, which is quite funny because the EPS 16 was incredibly plasticky, whereas this is all metal. So it is utterly built like a tank, and it weighs sort of about the same way as a tank, if I'm brutally honest. And it was released actually within months of the EPS 16. And I'm not sure in 1990 which one came first, but I believe the EPS 16 was before this, and this was the next. Was later in the year, so I think the EPS 16 was earlier in the year. And being the SQ2 means it came after the SQ1. And the SQ1 was a 61 note keyboard that preceded this, and it will appear somewhere up here. Now, if I'm reading the literature right and the research I've done, the SQ1 very quickly morphed into two keyboards. One was the SQ1 Plus, and the second was the SQ2. And the majority of the difference between the SQ1 Plus and the SQ2 was around the size of the keyboard, whereas the SQ1 Plus was 61 note. This is a 76 note, as I said. But there were actually a whole sequence of SQ boxes around this period of time. So the SQ1 was the first box to arrive. The SQ1 Plus arrived. The SQR, the SQR Plus, and the KS32 were also keyboards from the same lineage. In terms of what they had in common was they all used the same logic engine to generate the voices that these things played. So in essence, they were one in the same keyboard with slightly different features. And I'm not going to run into the features of each one of the different ones, apart from there is a sort of a hint that the SQR was the rack mount version. So they did effectively, and as I said, I'm not quite sure on the sequence of this, but logic says it was the SQ1, the SQR, the SQ1 Plus, the SQR Plus, the SQ2, the KS32. That's what I believe the sequence was, but I could be wrong. Okay. So and it seemed to be a very quick evolution as well. So the SQ1 to the SQ1R and the SQ2 was a very, very short period of time. In actual fact, I believe the timeline says the SQ1 was 1990. I don't believe that to be correct. I think the SQ1 was a late 89 keyboard release, but this and the SQ1 Plus were released in 90. Okay, so there was only literally about a year between the first machine and the second machine, and I think the SQ1 Plus was pushed to market quickly to address the issues with the SQ1. And the problem I'm having is I couldn't quite find out what the issues with the SQ1 were. Ensoniq had a reputation for sort of pushing stuff out with buggy software or buggy firmware and build quality issues. Whether that was the issue with the SQ1, I am not sure. But this and the SQ1 Plus came to market very, very quickly following the release of the SQ1. So draw into that what you will. Manufacturers normally allow things to sort of mature in the market for a few years before they issue a replacement. So to do it so quickly indicates that there was either a demand for a keyboard with more functionality, or the original keyboard had flaws that they wanted to get out of the market. Now, I have seen reference to some SQ1 owners were given upgrades to the SQ1 Plus. Whether that was free of charge or not, I'm not sure. But that I've seen sort of references to that, but I can't substantiate that particular comment. But that sort of kind of with the timelines, etc., would sort of seem to be fair, if that makes sense. The SQ1 and the SQ1 Plus and the SQ2, I believe to be probably the same keyboard in terms of the documentation for this keyboard actually is the documentation for the SQ1 Plus 61-note keyboard and the SQ2 76-note keyboard. So that's kind of where this is coming from. I'm just going to put this down because it's sort of digging into my knees. But the key differences, as far as I can tell, are the fact that this has 76 notes, and apparently this has a better sprung keyboard to it. So, and it actually does have a much nicer action on this keyboard than the EPS keyboard. I have to be honest, the EPS keyboard is horrible. This actually has a much better action on it. So that seems to be sort of the key differences between the One Plus and this one, but the documentation kind of sort of refers to both in the same vein and just calls out whether one is doing something in a different way to the other. So, so in terms of the keyboard itself, this has 100 voices in the ROM. That was static. Then it had a RAM component that had a further 80 voices in it. And then on the memory card, whether it was a ROM or a RAM cartridge that went into that, or a ROM or a RAM card that went into that memory card slot, you could have a further 160 voices. Now, so 100 plus 80 plus 160 gives us 340 voices that you could have actually installed on this thing at any point in time, which actually for the period that this keyboard came out was actually quite good. So if you think about the T series, which was probably the direct competition, I would say, to this particular workstation. They did call it a workstation. The T series had 100 voices in bank A, 100 voices in bank B, and 100 combinations, which is where you could combine the two together. But that's effectively would be the competition around the same time. The way this keyboard works is, and it uses pretty much the same principle that many of the keyboards of the time were using. It uses 167 what it refers to as sampled acoustic and synthetic waves, which can then be passed through 3 oscillators on the machine to give you your voice. Okay. It also states that there are something called Ensoniq's proprietary, and I have to read this, trans waves, which are stated as having greater harmonic complexity and timbral motion. If that's not been through the marketing department, I don't know what has. In layman's English, I would say these are better and more complex samples. That's kind of how I would read it. Now, all the other manufacturers in this space were doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Korg called it AI synthesis, Roland called it LA synthesis. But in essence, it was the same idea. It was a very, very good quality PCM style sample that they then used to generate the voice that the keyboard generated and played. Again, referring to probably the competition at this point in time in terms of workstation, the T series, and those that know that T series was the evolution of the M series. So when I'm talking about T series, I'm really talking about the evolution of the M series. And the M series was still being sold at this point, remember. But the T series, that was the evolution, only had 2 oscillators on it. But both machines used a 4-layer envelope system for actually shaping the waveform when you hit the keyboard, when you hit the key. So the envelope shaping was the same, but you had more oscillators on this than you did on the T. Whether that's better or not, I don't know. Although I do think, and in fact I'm pretty sure, that the 2 oscillator system on the T was more multi-timbral than this system. So this system, and it's a bit confusing in the documentation, but the way I understand it is this, when you're using 1 oscillator, will generate 21 separate notes. If you're using 3 oscillators, that is divided by 3, so you get 7 notes. Okay, whereas the T could quite easily generate 16. Okay, so there was a difference there. The keyboard itself is fairly versatile in terms of how you look at this keyboard. And in fact, it actually says on the literature there is a disk drive, and I'm just looking for the disk drive because I can't see a disk drive on it. I can't, yeah. It says in the literature about a disk drive, and I can't see a disk drive, so I think that's a load of rubbish. Maybe I'm just being thick. No, there's not a disk drive on this. It must be a different one of the range. Anyway, this thing has obviously the memory card and the ability to download SysX2 from a computer. Standard functionality, exactly the same as the Korg. However, the Korg did have the disk drive that this thing doesn't seem to have. Hey-ho. And don't get confused by the 32 voices either, because that's a misnomer, as far as I can tell, because the documentation talks about 32 voices, and then it starts talking about 21 independent notes and 7 through 3 oscillators. So the whole thing is a little bit confusing. So yes, the RAM cartridge is here. I don't know why the previous owner has sellotaped it up. I suspect that's so that you don't get dust into it, or it could be that it's not working. So it may be that I need to take this thing to pieces. to have a look at that and see if that is just a reader issue or whether we've got more problems going on. Looking at the back of this keyboard, so I'm just going to do that. I'm not going to show it. But looking at the back of the keyboard, we have phones, left-right outputs, pedal and CV, foot switch, standard 3 MIDI sockets, and a power cable at the back here. So fairly standard of a keyboard at this sort of age. Again, because they've described this as a workstation, we need to sort of look at these workstation credentials. Basically, it has on board a 16-track sequencer, which is bigger than the 8-track sequencer that is on the T1. But it does state that the 16-track sequencer is only capable of 9,000 notes unless you have the memory expansion installed, at which point that rises up to 58,000 notes. And then again, the literature sort of gets a bit hazy. I suspect then it goes on to state that it can then do 70 sequences, or it can hold 70 sequences in that sort of 58,000 note bank of memory. Whereas the T1, again, going back to that 8-track sequencer, 50,000 notes in the 8-track sequencer. So the sequencer on this is more functional in terms of how it works and its capacity than the T. Then moving on again to the effects level, this has a full 24-bit digital effects system. The T also has a digital effects system. In fact, at the time, the T was considered to be one of the best. The M and the T were considered to be one of the best digital effects systems that you could get on a keyboard at that point in time. So, in terms of its workstation credentials, it doesn't have a sampler, but samplers tended to be the next generation from here. The samplers were brought into the workstation environment. Now we consider that a workstation really should have a sampler as well, or sampling capability. And pretty much, I mean, if I go and look at my Oasis and I go and look at my Kronos, both of those have sampling capabilities. I mean, the Kronos sampling capability is pretty damn good. But I have to also say that if I was going to be playing with samples, I think that my dedicated samplers are a better capability than actually going into the Kronos directly. So using the Kronos to trigger an external hardware sampler, I've found, unless you're going to mix the sample into something you're doing on the Kronos, actually a better mechanism. So the fact that this doesn't have a sampler and I've got dedicated hardware samplers doesn't really matter. But in terms of fulfilling the criteria of a workstation of 1990, this definitely fulfills that area. So looking at this, the next time you see this particular board, it will be switched on, and we'll see what sort of noises we can get out of it. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that video is going to be sooner rather than later, because there's a lot of things going on. But I am going to try and get something recorded, hopefully by the end of January, so you can definitely see the SQ2 and the EPS 16 switched on and functioning. But for this week's rant, Ensoniq Waterfall, the arrival of the SQ2 to Studio One. Catch you all guys later. Bye-bye. If you liked the content of the video you've just seen, please give it a thumbs up. It just helps the YouTube algorithm with its selection process. If you want to leave a comment, please feel free to do that as well. Down below somewhere should be the ability to do that. I do try to respond to all the comments that are raised on the channel. Sometimes it takes me a few weeks because of what I'm doing, and I'm getting more and more comments and questions raised on the channel, so it just takes sometimes a little bit of time to do a bit of research. If you want to be notified when I put more rants, mailbags, and videos about this sort of legacy tech and even modern tech on the channel, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell icon, and you'll be notified by YouTube when stuff happens. I try to publish at least 2 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Until next time, bye-bye.